Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back. Today's show, truly a special one. We have an individual who is certainly bringing sanity in every sense of the word back to family practice medicine. We have a stalwart medical doctor. We have Jeffry N. Gerber, who is an FAAP board-certified family physician and owner of a South Suburban family medicine practice in Littleton, Colorado, where he is known as Denver's Diet Doctor. And folks, I tip my hat especially to Dr. Gerber, because if you go to his website, which is quite wonderful, it's denversdietdoctor.com, right on the homepage, he tells us good food is good medicine, and as common sense as that sounds, I think we've all experienced that it's not that common in the medical practice. So Dr. Gerber, thank you for bringing sanity back to medicine, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful introduction, John. And I can't take credit for that saying "good food is good medicine." I stole it from an individual by the name of Hippocrates.
I think he has an oath that you took at one point, didn't he?
Yes, that's true.
Well, thank you for resurrecting that many thousands year old phrase. Dr. Gerber, tell me what led you to this seemingly obvious but seemingly lost conclusion in in medicine.
Yes, John. Well, I've been a family physician. I'm traditional allopathic trained doctor almost for 20 years now. My training was back in Philadelphia at Temple University, both undergraduate and for medical school, and spent a couple years of doctoring in Philadelphia area, and then in '93 moved out to Colorado. And my focus was based on mainstream at the time, low fat, low calorie, based on traditional dietary guidelines, the USDA food pyramid, so on and so forth. And over the first half of my career, the first 10 years, just seemed to be kind of frustrated because nutrition really didn't make sense. They just said to, watch the quantity of food, eat less, exercise more. And in my clinical experience, it was very hard for people to do something like that and to adhere to a program where it was essentially self-deprivation and didn't see much success. So I have to say that a change for myself and my focus really came in the late 90s, starting with my patients who had come in and done a lot of reading about nutrition. They were reading back at the time it was Atkins. One particular patient was reading Suzanne Summers. I think she's written lots of books on lots of everything. And one of the books was about nutrition, and it was actually suggesting that reducing carbohydrates in the diet might be a good thing to do. And that one patient really stuck with me. And back in the time, I told most patients that came in telling me they were going to try Atkins diet, like most docs, I would say, well, that's not healthy. You're going to drop dead from a heart attack eating all that meat and fat. And I said, okay, well, we'll watch you. And to my surprise, their metabolic markers like their cholesterol and blood sugar started to improve. And I said, that's kind of interesting. Let me read a little bit further about it. And also had some experience with family members who were trying this. There seemed to be a surge, at least for me in the 90s, where all these different people were coming at this from different angles in terms of this new nutritional approach. And then I had some personal experience, and after reading quite a bit, that light bulb went off in my head, and I said, aha, this makes sense. And what we've learned for, basically the past 30 years seemed to be quite problematic, that the issue here is not about perhaps eating less and exercising more, but more about how the macronutrients interact with our metabolism, and that it turns out that the carbohydrates tend to be fattening and inflammatory, and these are this is the type of macronutrient that is probably more associated with chronic diseases like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, heart disease. And really from that point forward, it has been just an awakening event for myself and for my patients. And we realized and learned what primary care is really all about and what primary prevention is, and to focus on appropriate nutritional programs. And so we've just had so much fun. It's made what I do enjoyable. Instead of treating heart disease and diabetes and strokes, we teach people how to prevent chronic diseases, John. So it's been very rewarding.
But Dr. Gerber, I can only imagine that helping people to avoid disease rather than to help them live with the disease, it's a bit like trying to put the spilled milk back in the glass. Not nearly as rewarding, and there's probably still going to be a stain on the floor. But why is it, Dr. Gerber, that maybe, I don't know. I mean, I'm probably not as smart as a lot of the doctors out there, but this seems so commonsensical. It seems to say, let food be thy medicine, right? That's been said for so many years, yet people who say that, and I'm curious if you've had any experience with this, are sometimes thought of as, let's just use the same word people used for Dr. Adkins, a quack. This seems the furthest thing from quackery I could imagine. What's going on here?
Right. Well, it seems that anybody thinking outside the box in any area, you can consider them a quack, but the magic of is their ability to, free their mind and at least to explore other options. And in terms of the world of nutrition, we're so mainstream is so hung up in sticking to the norm and what is preached by most. And I think doctors, intelligent people in general, we're usually very good at following rules, and it's spelled out, and it's all based on our background, our education, and traditionally we're trained to focus on eating less and exercising more, and that's basically been the mantra. And I guess our job, both you and myself and others out there that have really opened themselves up to redefining healthy nutrition, would be a goal to re-educate everybody interested in health.
And Dr. Gerber, what is it about this one area of medicine? Let's say obesity and diabetes are two related areas. Because I was listening to Dr. Peter Attia, who's one of the president and co-founder of NUSI or NUSI with Gary Taubes, and he tells a wonderful story. If you haven't watched his talk, all listeners, I would highly recommend it. And he talks about how when he was doing cancer research, challenging the norm and looking outside of the box and recognizing when things aren't working and trying new things is praised in medicine. But it seems like when it comes to diabetes and obesity, trying new approaches, the exact opposite respect is given. And in fact, let's keep the analogy going. When it comes to cancer, the guidance is not avoid everything. It's avoid carcinogenic substances. Avoid substances known to contribute to the likelihood of cancer. We know sugar contributes to diabetes, but we just say eat less. We don't just say avoid sugar. Why is there such a disconnect between nutrition and obesity and diabetes and other medical issues such as cancer?
Yeah, Peter's great, and NUSI and Gary Taubes, and I had a chance to listen to Peter talk about cholesterol recently. But it is a great analogy in terms of cancer. They try anything and everything. And I guess nutrition doesn't work that way. And there is a big disconnect. And perhaps some people view nutrition more in the realm of a religious experience rather than true science. And there may be a certain amount of truth in that, because it is so difficult to scientifically explore nutrition in terms of doing feeding trials on people, and in a sense imprisoning or caging individuals for a period of time where they're forced to only eat certain types of foods, and then you create this experiment, and how long can you possibly run that? Plus, on the top of it, that maybe that's not even a good experiment because in real life, people aren't caged and they aren't necessarily very strict in their diet. So I think the problem with it is just it's so hard to study nutrition and to really understand what's going on. And it's really the NUSI organization that is trying to study this in a scientific and more important, in an unbiased way, to look at macronutrients. I think they're working on a null hypothesis, or a hypothesis that insulin and these fat storage hormones such as insulin and leptin really play a significant role in terms of these chronic diseases that we're dealing with, and to look at macronutrients in particular, and maybe they'll even look at micronutrients. I think there's a lot of interest in that as well, and to hopefully come up with some answers as to what's going on.
Well, I love what you said, Dr. Gerber, about it's so difficult to study nutrition, because not only is it so difficult to study nutrition in terms of isolating variables, but it's also so easy to make blanket moral statements about the cause. It's pretty hard to say, well, actually there was, with lung cancer and smoking, you say, oh, don't smoke, you don't get lung cancer. But with other forms of cancer, it's very difficult to just say, do less of this and more of this and you won't get cancer. but it's very easy to make the assumption that if you just eat less food and you just exercise more, that you can avoid these things. But it's also true that if you took less breaths in, you would probably have less likelihood of getting lung cancer. But again, we don't seem to make those connections. We don't seem to dig any deeper.
Yeah, well, that's correct. And so a little funny side story on nutrition is that essentially mainstream is telling us to just stop eating. And so if you go to the endocrinologist and he tells you that, well, he's worried about your diabetes, so you have to cut out your carbohydrates. And then they go to the cardiologist and he says, well, I'm worried about your cholesterol and fat, and so you got to cut back on fat content. And then you go to the nephrologist and he's worried about your kidneys and he tells you to cut back on protein. And so that basically says, well, maybe I'll be healthier if I just stop eating.
Which what is that? The old logical reductio ad absurdum, where you show if the argument leads to an absurd conclusion, as this one certainly did, certainly there has to be something wrong with that logic.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, these are things that have been always just floating around in my head, and the first law of thermodynamics, that you eat less and exercise more. Well, let me rephrase that. We don't cheat physics. The rules of physics apply no matter where you are, but there's much more to it than just principles of thermodynamics. It's really has to do with these fat storage signals, and that's where our focus has been. I think cholesterol is another interesting area to discuss. I think this year I really have I've always been fascinated in cholesterol, and there's this big debate between is it cholesterol that causes heart disease, or the alternative hypothesis that it is perhaps inflammation and oxidative stress that seems to be causing heart disease and atherosclerosis and plaque. And it just brings us back to this whole idea of thinking outside the box.
Well, I love getting back, Dr. Gerber, to your point about this flawed paradigm of if you just avoid food, then clearly all these problems will also be avoided, because we also see that in some of the vegan or vegetarian, and let's be very clear, you can be a healthy vegetarian. I'm not here to say any critique of vegetarians, but sometimes you talked about carbohydrates are attacked for this reason and fat is attacked for that reason. And we hear this mythology about protein, in some cases promoting cancer. And there's this, it promotes the stimulation of IGF-1. which stimulates the growth of cancer. Well, IGF-1 stimulates the growth of everything. It's an anabolic substance. So it also promotes the growth of your muscles and bones so you don't turn into a pile of osteoporotic and a sarcopenia-ridden person. So how do we, and it just seems that there's this moral conflation taking place. Like, it really becomes a moral discussion and a religious discussion, as you talked about. How can we help bring more science and more common sense back to the field of nutrition?
Yeah, so good points, Jonathan. I have actually some lacto-ovo vegetarian low-carb people. It's almost an oxymoron.
It's certainly a tongue twister.
Yeah, we have a great group of people up in, actually, throughout Colorado, but a group in Boulder that are actually low-carb vegetarians, and they put an interesting angle. And, looking back on it, I think back in the 1970s, some of the nutrition councils with McGovern, the McGovern report, they're actually vegetarians on that board. And it actually seemed at the time that vegetarianism really seemed to feed into this low-fat, low-calorie mantra. And so it seemed to go together. And I think that, it's kind of changing a little bit in terms of what we understand. And you brought up vegetarianism, which always makes me think about other types of diets. And I tend to look at, what's in common with all these particular things. And that might be a great starting point. Some people like to say, well, my diet's better than your diet. And I said, well, let's find some common ground.
Yep.
What do you think about that, John?
Oh, Dr. Gerber, I'm a huge fan of celebrating the similarities rather than demonizing the differences, and I think that really is the common sense thing, and why I get a little confused, because we talked about MDs are smart people. You cannot get through medical school without being a baseline intelligent person, and the idea that consuming substances found directly in nature that contain the most essential things for human nutrition, which are amino acids, essential fats, vitamins, and minerals. There's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, that contain the most of those things and the least of things we don't need. Seems that that just seems like saying having more happiness is better than having less happiness. Like, it has to be true. So why don't we just accept that and move on?
Yeah, exactly. So, that is the common ground that we, at least let's say we eat real food, unprocessed food. The food that comes into our palate, and that we eat should be as nutrient dense as possibly we can get. And then I totally agree that, in terms of macronutrients, dietary fat, dietary protein, number one, are mostly essential building blocks. Number two, they do provide sources of energy. And clearly carbohydrate is the optional fuel. That's exactly how I've been speaking about it for years. And yet, the dietary guidelines that we've been following since the late 1970s have made carbohydrates the predominant macronutrient that we consume. And so again, in terms of common ground, most people agree that we should be reducing carbohydrates in the diet. We should eat, a healthier form of carbohydrate. I think that has to be yet defined and agreed upon. But I think for people like myself and you, that the more insulin resistant you are, the better off you are trying to avoid carbohydrate as much as possible. And it's interesting that, why are there so many insulin-resistant people in the United States these days? And everyone seems to have an opinion. And, my opinion really lies in what are the predominant macronutrient that stimulates the fat storage hormones, such as insulin and leptin. And the answer is it's carbohydrates, and we're eating too many of them.
And you, Dr. Gerber, you're spot on that anyone, even a well-formulated vegetarian diet, people who talk about they've seen wondrous health benefits, of course you'll get wondrous health benefits if you go from a standard American diet, which contains 40 to 60% processed garbage, to if you go to any form of eating that eliminates that 40 to 60% of processed garbage. Like, you could just be eating whatever. Like, I mean, you're going to see marked health improvements. The question I sometimes find fascinating is, so like vegetables, obviously everyone seems to agree, well, except there's some extremists out there, but pretty much everyone seems to agree that non-starchy vegetables are good for you. And everyone agrees that you need some level of protein. And I've never heard, I spoke with Dr. Joel Fuhrman the other day, and even he acknowledged, nuts, seeds, natural whole food fats, those are good for you. So the question then just comes into, where do you get your calories from? Because you do need some energy. You need energy, and you're probably going to get most of your energy from either carbohydrate or fat, because using protein as an energy source is probably not metabolically optimal. So should you get the majority of your calories from fat or from carbohydrate? What do you think and why?
Yeah, so that's the big area of disagreement. So you can go from a vegan to a vegetarian to a Mediterranean diet to a paleo diet to a low carb diet, and everyone seems to have a little bit of not a little. Everyone has a different opinion, but one thing is that you do want to individualize people's diet based on looking at metabolism, and that's what we do in our office each and every day. People are often confused. There's just information overload. So we try to provide guidance. We measure metabolic markers. We look for degrees of insulin resistance, and it answers questions. Well, how much protein, fat, and carbohydrate should we be consuming? And, in my population, my expertise is really treating chronic disease first, and treating the cause of chronic disease, which I believe to be chronic low levels of inflammation, by things in our lifestyle, such as diet, lack of exercise, maybe alcohol, smoking, those kinds of things. And diet's really the last uncharted area. But we do see quite a few patients that have weight issues, and they tend to be insulin resistant. And the answer for those patients tend to be reducing carbohydrates, so reducing that source of energy and increasing natural fats in the diet. And yes, that when we talk about natural fats, we're talking about saturated fat, which may be a preferred source of fuel in terms of energy that we consume. And again, it goes against traditional wisdom, but when you look at fat storage hormones, you realize that natural saturated fats in the diet don't trigger these fat storage hormones. And so it's actually a good thing to be eating these natural fats. Now, Joel Fuhrman, who, is a vegetarian, perhaps vegan, since you talked to him, I think he kind of vacillates back and forth. But, with respect to animals, if people, for ethical reasons don't want to eat animals, that's fine. And I understand that and respect that. But when you look at individuals, not only vegetarians, but other people that tend to eat a lot of carbohydrates, and they come in and they have all these chronic illnesses, you have to take a look at it and say, hey, I think that the carbohydrate consumption may indeed be a problem. And, sometimes, they say, well, we eat healthy whole grains. So are they real foods? And, from my perspective, grains are definitely problematic, John.
Oh, I think the scientific community would have a hard time arguing with that. And I think Dr. Davis, the author of Wheat Belly, puts the logic very well, where this conflation of not as bad for you and good for you are right. Like, breaking one leg is not as bad as breaking two legs. That doesn't mean we recommend people go break their right leg.
Right.
Similarly, whole grains are better for you. They are less bad for you than refined grains. However, that does not mean they are good for you, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I love hearing Dr. Davis talk about that. And Gary Taubes also often talked about, well, the same applies to cigarettes. Smoke light cigarettes. They're not as bad for you.
Well, and Dr. Gerber, you mentioned something about trying to determine what would be the best balance of certain macronutrients for your patients based on some tests and metabolic profiles you look at. Now, one factor I could imagine we talk about when individuals perform intense resistance training, that dials up the amount of protein you would need to eat because you obviously need to repair your muscle cells. What do you see as being other critical factors? Obviously, insulin resistance. The more insulin resistant you are, the less affinity you have towards carbohydrate. But what other markers could people look for to help them find that right ratio?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So I think insulin resistance is a great way to start. And it's really new science because the idea of staging insulin resistance is out there, but there's no consensus as to a staging system at this point. But what we've done is we've came up with our own staging system based on doing a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test. We do hemoglobin A1C, C-peptide, which is kind of part of a pro-insulin molecule. We look at CRP, we look at lipid profile, and it really gives us a sense of insulin resistance. We'd love to find some other markers that would tell us, well, how do we optimize a person's diet based on level of activity? But granted, if you're, a bodybuilder, you need more protein. I've met some wonderful bodybuilders that knew more about nutrition than I ever did 10 years ago. And I know that you do a lot of bodybuilding yourself. You're in excellent shape. I guess I'm jealous, but good for you, John. But, we have a lot of athletes that come in, and it's interesting. Well, are you an athlete that became overweight? Or you're an athlete that wants to enhance his performance? And it all makes a difference. Are you an endurance athlete that you have to, that plays into it? Jeff Volek and Stephen Finney, who wrote The Art and Science of Low Carb Performance, they talk about the benefits of the ketogenic athlete. And I find that fascinating. I wonder often how that would affect power lifters, which I know Jeff Volek is a power lifter, but how it affects explosive energy. And in my experience, what I found is that if we put people that are trying to lose weight and they're doing explosive types of exercises, my experience has been that it kind of changes the explosivity of it. And so it's different again with each athlete. You have to find the balance and what works. I can tell you what doesn't work. I have some bodybuilders that have been at it for years and they're in their 40s. And one guy comes in, he says, Dr. Gerber, if I don't eat 200 grams of protein a day, I'm just not going to be able to power lift and I'm just going to collapse. Well, this, unfortunately, he's still muscular, but he's overweight and he's got hypertension, he's got prediabetes, and we can see the end effect of what he thinks is a healthy diet to help him improve exercise performance. But on the other side, we're seeing some chronic illness developing. So it's a good question, John, and I don't think I have quite the answer. So we just kind of work it out on an individual basis.
Dr. Gerber, two things I want to dig into. One is I love how you brought up athletes and bodybuilders, because I want to talk about how a field where results are all that matter becomes interesting. But one quick point I wanted to just clarify. Was your concern with the patient you just regarded that you believed at his body composition consuming 200 grams of protein per day was causing his illness, or was it something else, or what range of protein do you generally recommend? What say you?
Yeah, so it was a combination of things. He also tended to eat a lot of carbohydrate.
Okay.
Yeah, he tended to eat. It wasn't just protein, but it was it was a more of a standard American diet that he was consuming that was extra high in protein. And the problem is, protein through gluconeogenesis can be, that energy can, or that macronutrient can be converted to carbohydrate and have some ill effects. And so, we agree that moderate protein is probably a better answer to the question, and perhaps a little more protein. And again, it's an individual on an individual basis. We usually end up having patients consume somewhere between 80 and 100 grams of protein a day, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. And I guess if you're a bodybuilder, you might push that up a little bit. But I think 200 grams sounds like a lot by anybody's standard, John.
Fascinating, Dr. Gerber. And I want to get back to, you brought up athletes and bodybuilders, because I think it's a fascinating population to look at, because in a field in which, like, when your job is to be lean, when your job depends, when your paycheck depends on having a certain level of body fat percentage, other things other than just what works go out the window. All you're interested in is what works. And it's fascinating if you actually look back, ever since the inception of bodybuilding or any physique athletes, it was always just eat the most nutrient-dense food you can, and ironically, a lot of it. Like, if you want to be lean, since the 1910s, 20s, it's always been the same message. Eat a lot of the food that contains the most of which is required and the least of what isn't required. And you have to eat a lot of it. I mean, you see bodybuilders consuming 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 calories a day and being extremely lean because of the quality of the food they're consuming. So in some ways, we see this new movement now about food quality, but in some ways it's an incredibly old movement. It just has only been in this niche bodybuilding world. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I was really impressed. I attended my first Paleo FX in Austin a bit ago, and I couldn't believe how healthy a group of people were attending this conference. And a lot of them were obviously, bodybuilders in just great shape. And, they're eating real food and nutrient-dense foods. And I mean, again, I learned so much from bodybuilders dating way back that, they basically ate, real foods, and they cut out carbs and bread, and, they knew that the carbohydrates were fattening. And so that was the first thing that they eliminated. And, again, they've done a lot of things right. They can be accused of doing a lot of things wrong for the sake of competition, and you can be sure that they know what they're doing wrong. But again, it's a matter of taking the things, the observations, and unfortunately, they're just observations at this time because studying nutrition is so hard. But taking information from everywhere and coming up with better solutions for all of us.
And the irony, Dr. Gerber, is that, we talked about in the bodybuilding community how the elimination, if you want to lean down, you eliminate those starches and sugars. And on the flip side, go to your local supplement store and look for a weight gainer on the shelf. Guess what its number one ingredient will be? Maltodextrin. Yep. So it's not, there's bodybuilders you could very easily melt sticks of butter and drink them, but people tend to not do that when they're trying to gain weight. And when we try to fatten cattle, what do? We feed them corn. We feed them starch. It's definitely more than obvious, John, what's going on. And, hopefully we're all going to be going in the right direction. I was at a conference in Boulder, I think, a half a year ago, and it was wonderful because it was the series was comparing and contrasting diets, and we had
let's see, we had Mediterranean diet represented. We had the paleo diet. We had the vegetarian diet, and we had the Ayurvedic diet, which is, to me, that's mindful eating, and I just love that. And just taking bits and pieces of it and putting it together, and hopefully all going in one direction with it.
I love it. I love it. Well, Dr. Gerber, certainly you are on the front lines of moving the medical field into that right direction. And I salute you, because I know it's not easy when your career and your license and your credentials are on the line. It's very easy in quotations for people like me to sit behind my computer and talk about nutrition and exercise. But when your livelihood and when literally decades of professional work are on the line, and you have the courage to stand by the science and stand by the results rather than just falling into the shadows of the mythology, I salute you. And I would encourage all our listeners to salute you as well by supporting you on social media, checking out your website, which again is denversdietdoctor.com. And folks, again, please do show some love for Dr. Jeff Gerber. Again, always we need to salute and support our MDs out there who are respecting the wisdom that is our body and that wisdom that is natural food. So thank you again, Dr. Gerber. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, sure, John. There actually is enough evidence for me to come out here and make some comments and statements. You know, the American Diabetes Association does recognize low-carb diets. So I've done my homework, and I think there is, there's some relatively well-done clinical trials in the last 10 years, albeit short-term, that really show the benefits of low-carb, high-fat diets versus traditional low-fat calorie diets. So I do have a little bit out there to back me up, but thank you for the comments.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, and certainly when we talk about what we don't seem to have a lot of things backing up is whatever we're currently doing, because what do we stand to lose by trying something else other than the type 2 diabetes and other than the extra 40 pounds of body fat we're carrying around, right? So
definitely, we have 30 years of experience to see that's not working, and so the point is we kind of have to forge forward and try different things. I mean, we don't have these long-term, outcome studies that are providing us with these hard endpoints, looking at diet and mortality and heart attack and stroke and these kinds of things. But does that mean that we're gonna wait and stick with the standard dogma? And we may be long dead before they ever figure it out, or do we forge forward and try different things and look outside the box? And that's exactly what we're doing, John.
And the irony, again, Dr. Gerber, is we don't, that data doesn't exist for any form of eating. And we've tried to come up with it for the standard American diet. We've spent I document this in my book, we've spent over $1 billion trying to prove the high carbohydrate diet right. And they've all failed. So if anyone were to say, well, you don't have enough evidence to do something different, well, you don't have enough evidence to do anything by that logic. So,
well said, John. It's so true.
Oh, well, Dr. Gerber, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Hey, invite me back, John. I love the work that you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Again, please do check out Dr. Jeff Gerber's work. He's over at denversdietdoctor.com. Thank you again for joining us. And remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Talk with you soon.